The Roots of the Irish Mob, From 5 Points to Prohibition. The story of the Irish mob in America begins not in the criminal underworld, but in the desperate struggle for survival. It is a story forged in the fires of famine, poverty, and mass migration. In the mid-19th century, Ireland was devastated by the Great Famine. This catastrophic event triggered a massive exodus to the United States. Between 1845 and 1855, over 1 million Irish immigrants arrived on American shores. They landed in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, often with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They faced immediate and vicious discrimination. Help wanted signs often included the phrase, "No Irish need apply." They were crowded into the most squalid and dangerous urban slums. The most notorious of these was the 5 Points neighborhood in Lower Manhattan. This was a sprawling slum of ramshackle tenements and open sewers. It was here that the first Irish gangs began to form. These early groups were born from a need for protection and community. They had names like the Dead Rabbits, the Y.O.s, and the 40 Thieves. Their activities were largely street-level, petty theft, brawling, and protection rackets. But they were fiercely territorial and incredibly violent. They fought not just rival gangs, but also the nativist, anti-immigrant groups that targeted them. The most famous of these early conflicts were the New York City draft riots of 1863. What began as a protest against Civil War conscription laws exploded into a bloody race riot. Irish immigrants, angry that they were being forced to fight for a country that despised them, targeted free black communities. The violence revealed the complex and often tragic racial dynamics of the time. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the Irish began to climb the social ladder. One of the few paths to power available to them was through politics and civil service. They mastered the political machine, with Tammany Hall in New York becoming a powerful, Irish-dominated force. But another path, a darker one, was through organized crime. The single biggest catalyst for the rise of the Irish mob was Prohibition. In 1920, the 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. This did not stop people from drinking. It created a massive, lucrative black market overnight. The Irish, with their established presence in ports, police departments, and political machines, were perfectly positioned to capitalize. In Boston, a man named Charles King Solomon rose to power. He controlled much of the city's rum-running operations. He was a classic gangster figure, operating speakeasies and running liquor from Canada. His reign was short-cut when he was murdered in 1933, but his organization lived on. In New York, the underworld was more diverse, but Irish gangs held significant power. Oney the Killer Madden was a key figure. A former leader of the Gopher Gang, he became a major bootlegger and co-owned the famous Cotton Club in Harlem. He was known for his volatile temper and was suspected in at least 5 murders. Perhaps the most powerful Prohibition-era Irish gang was the Hudson Dusters. They controlled Manhattan's West Side and were known for their wild, drug-fueled parties. But their power was already waning by the end of the 1920s. Prohibition ended in 1933, but the criminal infrastructure it built remained. The Irish gangs had made fortunes and established deep connections. However, a new threat was emerging that would eventually eclipse them: the Italian-American Mafia. The Cosa Nostra was more structured, more secretive, and more disciplined. They began to muscle in on Irish territories and rackets. A period of bloody conflict and uneasy alliance began. The Irish gangs adapted,
specializing in certain areas where they could maintain an edge. They became known for their proficiency with violence, particularly as hired muscle and hitmen. They also maintained a stronghold in the labor unions, controlling key ports and trucking industries. This was the foundation upon which the modern Irish mob was built. It was a legacy of survival, violence, and a relentless drive for a piece of the American dream, no matter the cost. The stage was set for the rise of the most infamous Irish gangsters of the 20th century.
The Westies, Hell's Kitchen horrors. While Prohibition had created the first Irish crime kings, the post-war era saw the rise of street-level terror. No gang embodied this brutal new reality more than the Westies of Hell's Kitchen. This neighborhood on Manhattan's West Side was their kingdom of fear. The Westies emerged from the crumbling tenements and waterfront piers in the 1960s. They were not a sophisticated criminal corporation like the Italian mafia families. They were a loosely organized but fiercely loyal band of street thugs. Their reputation was built on one thing: sheer, unrestrained violence. The gang's most notorious leader was James Coonan. Coonan was a cold, calculating psychopath who took over the gang in the early 1970s. His rise to power was paved with blood. He consolidated his control by eliminating rival gang leaders in the neighborhood. One of his most infamous hits was on his own mentor, Mickey Spillane. Spillane was the previous leader of the Hell's Kitchen Irish. In 1977, Coonan had him lured to a bar under false pretenses. Spillane was shot dead, his body dismembered, and the parts scattered around the city. This gruesome act sent a clear message: cross James Coonan, and you will disappear without a trace. Dismemberment became a Westies trademark. It was a practical solution to body disposal, but also a powerful psychological weapon. The fear of literally being erased kept victims and rivals in line. Under Coonan, the Westies formed a dark partnership with the Italian mafia. They became the murder-for-hire squad for the Gambino crime family. The Italians saw the Westies as unpredictable, fearless, and deniable assets. They paid them handsomely for their services. One of their most famous hits was for Gambino boss Paul Castellano. The Westies were contracted to kill a longshoreman named William "Billy the Butcher" Mosso. The execution was carried out with clinical precision. This alliance was brokered by Coonan's right-hand man, Mickey Featherstone. Featherstone was the gang's primary enforcer, a volatile and haunted Vietnam veteran. He was responsible for many of the Westies' most brutal murders. But unlike Coonan, Featherstone was plagued by guilt and paranoia. He developed a serious drug habit, which made him increasingly unstable. The gang's criminal portfolio was diverse, but centered on violence. They ran traditional protection rackets, shaking down local businesses and construction sites. They controlled the drug trade, particularly heroin, in their territory. They were masters of loan sharking, lending money at exorbitant interest rates. Their signature scam was claiming the nut. They would infiltrate major corporations, like the World Trade Center operation, and embezzle huge sums of money. But their most reliable income came from the piers. Hell's Kitchen was a major shipping and receiving port. The Westies controlled the longshoremen's union through intimidation and murder. They extorted shipping companies and stole millions of dollars in cargo. Their reign of terror seemed unshakable. They operated with impunity for nearly 2 decades. Law enforcement struggled to build cases against them. Witnesses were too terrified to testify. Those who did often ended up dead. The gang's downfall began from within. Mickey Featherstone, facing a long prison sentence, decided to cooperate with the FBI.
He was the first high-ranking member to break the code of silence. His testimony was devastating. He detailed dozens of murders, dismemberments, and the gang's alliance with the Gambino family. The federal government built a massive RICO case against the Westies. In 1987, James Coonan and most of his crew were indicted. The trial exposed the gruesome inner workings of the gang. Featherstone described murders in graphic detail. He told the jury about bodies being cut up in bathtubs and dumped in the East River. The evidence was overwhelming. Coonan was convicted on 69 counts, including racketeering and murder. He was sentenced to 75 years in federal prison. The other key members received similarly long sentences. The Westies were effectively destroyed. But their legacy of violence left a permanent scar on Hell's Kitchen. The neighborhood would eventually be gentrified, but the memory of the Westies lingered. They represented a particularly savage chapter in the history of American organized crime. Their story demonstrated that raw brutality could be a successful criminal strategy for a time, but it also showed that such unrestrained violence ultimately contains the seeds of its own destruction. The Westies were gone, but in Boston, another Irish mobster was just hitting his stride. His name was James Whitey Bulger, and his story would become even more infamous.
The Winter Hill Gang, Boston's Irish powerhouse. As the Westies' reign of terror crumbled in New York, a more sophisticated and enduring Irish criminal organization was solidifying its power in Boston. This was the Winter Hill Gang, named after the Somerville neighborhood where it originated. Unlike the street-level brutality of the Westies, Winter Hill operated with a businessman's cunning. The gang's roots lay in the post-Prohibition era, a time of shifting criminal alliances. It was forged from a bloody conflict known as the Irish Gang War of the 1960s. On one side was the McLaughlin Brothers gang from Charlestown. On the other was the rival gang led by Bernard "Buddy" McLean. The conflict began over a personal insult, but escalated into a decade-long street war. Dozens of gangsters were murdered in shootings and ambushes. Buddy McLean emerged victorious, but he was soon murdered himself. Leadership of his faction fell to Howard "Howie" Winter. Winter was a sharp dresser and a smooth talker, more financier than fist fighter. He consolidated the various Irish crews under the Winter Hill banner. He focused on building a sustainable criminal enterprise, not just a street gang. Under Winter's leadership, the gang moved into high-profit, low-risk crimes. They masterminded a series of spectacular race-fixing schemes at horse tracks across New England. They bribed jockeys, doped horses, and placed huge winning bets through bookmakers. The scheme netted them millions of dollars, with little violence. They also became experts in large-scale truck hijacking. They targeted shipments of valuable goods like liquor, cigarettes, and clothing. They had inside information from corrupt teamsters and warehouse workers. The stolen goods were fenced through a network of legitimate-seeming businesses. But Winter's reign was relatively short. In 1972, he was convicted on federal charges related to the race-fixing scheme and sentenced to 27 months in prison. His departure created a power vacuum. Two men stepped in to fill it: James Whitey Bulger and Stephen the Rifleman Flemmy. This partnership would transform the Winter Hill Gang and plunge it into a dark new era. Whitey Bulger was a complex and contradictory figure. He was a ruthless gangster who lifted weights every day and avoided alcohol. He was a voracious reader with a keen interest in history and philosophy. He cultivated an image of a modern-day Robin Hood in South Boston's working-class housing projects. But beneath this carefully constructed facade was a cold-blooded psychopath. Stephen Flemmy was a seasoned hitman, known for his efficiency and lack of remorse. Together, they formed a deadly and effective leadership team.
They continued Winter's lucrative rackets, but added new, more violent ventures. They muscled in on the drug trade, particularly cocaine and marijuana. They extorted bookmakers and drug dealers, offering protection for a hefty fee. Those who refused to pay often met violent ends. But their most significant move was forming an alliance with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In 1975, Bulger and Flemmi were recruited as top echelon informants by FBI agent John Connolly. Connolly, a South Boston native, saw the gangsters as valuable assets in the FBI's war against the Italian mafia in New England. The Patriarca crime family was the Bureau's primary target. In exchange for information on the Italians, Bulger and Flemmi received virtual immunity from prosecution. The arrangement was a devil's bargain. Bulger and Flemmi used their protected status to eliminate rivals and tighten their grip on Boston's underworld. They provided the FBI just enough information to be useful, while systematically destroying anyone who threatened their own organization. They were effectively given a license to kill. The Winter Hill Gang under Bulger and Flemmi was a hybrid creature. It had the financial savvy of the old gang, combined with the absolute protection of the federal government. This period marked the peak of their power and the depth of their corruption. They were no longer just gangsters, they were untouchable princes of the city. Their reign would last for nearly 2 decades, until the walls finally began to close in. The story of the Winter Hill Gang is a quintessential Boston story of neighborhood loyalty, ruthless ambition, and ultimate betrayal. It shows how crime could become institutionalized, protected by the very forces sworn to stop it.
The Informant, Whitey Bulger, and the FBI. The most shocking chapter in the history of the Irish mob is not a gangland murder, but a deal made in a secret FBI office. The alliance between James Whitey Bulger and the Federal Bureau of Investigation represents one of the darkest stains in American law enforcement history. It is a story of corruption, betrayal, and the blurring of lines between cop and criminal. The architect of this unholy alliance was Special Agent John Connolly. Connolly grew up in the same South Boston housing projects as Whitey Bulger. He looked up to Bulger, who was older and had a reputation as a local tough guy. When Connolly joined the FBI, he never fully left that old neighborhood loyalty behind. In 1975, Connolly was assigned to the FBI's Boston office. His mission was to take down the Italian mafia, the Patriarca crime family. He knew that the best way to do this was from the inside. He turned to the most powerful Irish gangster in the city, James Whitey Bulger. Connolly made Bulger a simple, devastating offer: become a top echelon informant for the FBI. Provide information on the Italian mafia. In return, the FBI would protect him from prosecution. For Bulger, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. He could eliminate his primary competitors, the Italians, with the blessing of the federal government. He could operate his own criminal empire with impunity. He agreed to the deal. His partner, Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi, was also recruited. The arrangement was a catastrophic failure of justice. Bulger and Flemmi provided Connolly with information on the mafia. They gave up names, locations, and criminal operations. This information led to several successful prosecutions against the Patriarca family. But Bulger and Flemmi were careful. They only gave up information that would not harm their own operations. They used the FBI to wage a proxy war against their rivals. Meanwhile, they expanded their own criminal activities with newfound confidence. They knew that the FBI would look the other way. Agent Connolly became their guardian angel. He routinely tipped them off about ongoing investigations.
He warned them about wiretaps and informants within their own gang. He even provided them with confidential law enforcement information that they could use to their advantage. The protection was so comprehensive that Bulger and Flemmi felt untouchable. They grew increasingly brazen in their violence. They murdered anyone they perceived as a threat, including former associates and potential witnesses. One of their most notorious victims was Deborah Hussey. She was Flemmi's stepdaughter, and he suspected she might talk to the police. She was brutally murdered, and her body was buried in a shallow grave. Another victim was Arthur "Bucky" Barrett, a professional safecracker. They kidnapped him, tortured him for money, and then murdered him. The body count grew, but the FBI did nothing. The local police and the Massachusetts State Police were furious. They knew Bulger and Flemmi were responsible for a wave of murders, but every time they built a case, it would mysteriously fall apart. They did not know that the FBI was actively protecting the killers. The arrangement began to unravel in the late 1990s. A federal task force was finally formed to investigate Bulger. They discovered the shocking truth about his relationship with the FBI. Agent John Connolly was indicted on racketeering charges. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was later convicted of murder for his role in a hit tipped off by Bulger. But the main targets were now on the run. In 1995, a federal indictment was finally issued against Bulger and Flemmi. The charges included racketeering, extortion, and 19 counts of murder. Flemmi was arrested, but Bulger received a tip and vanished. He would remain one of the FBI's most wanted for 16 years. The scandal rocked the law enforcement community. It was revealed that the FBI had knowingly allowed innocent people to be framed for crimes committed by their informants. Several men had been wrongfully convicted and spent years in prison for crimes they did not commit. The U.S. Department of Justice was forced to pay millions in settlements to the victims' families. The story of Whitey Bulger and the FBI is a chilling cautionary tale. It shows how noble goals can be corrupted by personal loyalty and ambition. It demonstrates the danger of allowing the ends to justify the means. And it remains a painful reminder of how justice can be perverted from within. The Long Hunt. Whitey Bulger on the Run. On December 23, 1994, James Whitey Bulger received a phone call that would change his life. It was a warning from his FBI handler, John Connolly. A federal racketeering indictment was imminent. The protection that had shielded him for 2 decades had finally evaporated. Within hours, Bulger and his longtime girlfriend, Catherine Grigg, vanished from Boston. They left behind a city buzzing with rumors and a law enforcement community humiliated and enraged. The man they had protected was now their most wanted fugitive. The initial search was frantic but disorganized. Authorities scoured his known haunts in South Boston and Florida. They tracked his financial transactions and interviewed his associates. But Bulger had prepared for this moment. He had amassed a considerable cash fortune, estimated to be in the millions. He had multiple false identities and a deep understanding of how to evade capture. He and Grigg began a nomadic existence, moving from one low-profile location to another. Their first major stop was New York City. They stayed in Times Square, hiding in plain sight among the crowds. They then moved to Louisiana, living in a quiet apartment complex. They were careful, paying rent in cash and avoiding any unnecessary attention. Bulger's love of animals proved to be both a risk and a comfort. He was known to visit local libraries to read about history and wildlife. He and Grigg often posed as retirees from Chicago, a story that explained their lack of local ties. They kept to themselves, but Griggs' love for shopping and visiting dentists would later provide crucial clues. Back in Boston, the legal fallout was escalating. His brother, William Bulger, then the powerful president of the Massachusetts State Senate, was subpoenaed. He denied knowing his brother's whereabouts, but the spectacle deepened the public scandal. The FBI was under immense pressure to capture the man who had made them look like fools. The case grew cold for years. Bulger and Grigg moved to Grand Isle, Louisiana, where they lived in a secluded house. They befriended their neighbors, who knew them as Carol and Tom Baxter. They even cared for stray cats, with Bulger building shelters for them. This quiet life was shattered in 2002. Stephen Flemmi, facing multiple life sentences, decided to cooperate with prosecutors. His testimony detailed the extent of the gang's crimes and the FBI's corruption. The public learned about the dozens of murders and the twisted deal with the FBI. The hunt for Bulger was reignited, now fueled by national outrage. The FBI launched a dedicated task force. They analyzed every piece of evidence, no matter how small. They re-interviewed witnesses and offered a $2 million reward for information. They also turned to the media, featuring Bulger on television shows like America's Most Wanted. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Catherine Griggs' habits. The task force realized that Grigg was vain about her appearance. She had a history of visiting plastic surgeons and dentists. In 2011, the FBI launched a new publicity campaign focused not on Bulger, but on Grigg. They aired commercials in 14 cities highlighting her love for designer handbags and cosmetic procedures. They specifically targeted neighborhoods where they believed the couple might be hiding. The strategy worked. A former neighbor in Santa Monica, California, recognized Grigg from the news. She recalled a quiet couple who had lived in her building years earlier. They kept to themselves, but the woman had strikingly well cared-for teeth. The tip was passed to the FBI. Agents descended on a modest apartment building at 1012 3rd Street in Santa Monica, California. On June 22, 2011, they arrested an 81-year-old man without incident. He had $800,000 in cash hidden in the walls and a small arsenal of weapons. After 16 years on the run, Whitey Bulger was finally in custody. The capture was a media sensation. The frail old man in handcuffs was a far cry from the feared gangster of Boston lore. He was extradited to Boston to face his past. The long hunt was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. The story of Bulger's life on the run is a tale of two realities. It is a story of a man who outsmarted the system for 16 years. But it is also the story of a man trapped by his own notoriety, forever looking over his shoulder. His capture closed one chapter, but the final act of his story would be written in a courtroom.
The trial. Justice for Whitey Bulger. The capture of James Whitey Bulger in 2011 set the stage for one of the most anticipated trials in Boston's history. It was not just a criminal proceeding, it was a reckoning for the city, the FBI, and the victims' families who had waited decades for justice. The trial began on June 12, 2013 in Boston's federal courthouse. Bulger, now 83 years old, faced a sweeping 32-count indictment. The charges included racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and involvement in 19 murders. The prosecution's case was massive, built on years of investigation and the testimony of former associates. The trial was presided over by Judge Denise Casper. The courtroom was packed every day with media, spectators, and the families of Bulger's alleged victims. For them, this was a chance to finally confront the man who had haunted their lives. Bulger's defense team was led by J.W. Carney, Jr., a respected Boston attorney.
From the beginning, Carney made it clear that Bulger would not deny his crimes. The defense strategy was not about innocence, but about context and corruption. Bulger admitted he was a drug dealer, an extortionist, and a loan shark, but he vehemently denied being an FBI informant. This was a stunning position, given the overwhelming evidence of his deal with John Connolly. Bulger claimed that Connolly and former FBI agent John Morris had fabricated the informant files. He said they used him as a scapegoat to cover up their own corruption. He also claimed that he had paid Connolly for protection, but never provided meaningful information. The heart of Bulger's defense was that he had never killed women. He was particularly accused of strangling Deborah Davis, Stephen Flemy's girlfriend, in 1981. Bulger insisted he was not present for her murder. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of former Winter Hill Gang members. The star witness was Stephen the Rifleman Flemmy. Flemmy, serving a life sentence, provided chilling details about the gang's activities. He testified about numerous murders, including that of Deborah Davis. He stated that Bulger had personally strangled her while he, Flemmy, held her down. Other former associates, like John Martirano, also took the stand. Martirano, a convicted hitman, confessed to 20 murders. He described Bulger as a key partner in their criminal enterprise. The testimony was graphic and disturbing. Witnesses described bodies being buried in basements and along secluded beaches. They spoke of Bulger's cold demeanor and his obsession with control. The prosecution presented physical evidence to corroborate the stories. They had exhumed bodies from hidden graves, matching them to the witnesses' accounts. They presented financial records showing Bulger's vast wealth. They played secretly recorded conversations of Bulger discussing criminal activities. Perhaps the most dramatic moment came when Bulger himself was offered the chance to testify. After weeks of testimony against him, the courtroom waited to see if he would finally tell his side of the story. But Bulger declined. His lawyers stated that he felt the court had already made up his mind. They argued that the judge's ruling preventing him from testifying about his claim of receiving immunity from a former federal prosecutor made it impossible for him to get a fair hearing. This decision disappointed many who wanted to hear directly from the aging gangster. After 35 days of testimony and over 70 witnesses, the case went to the jury. The deliberations lasted for 5 days. The courtroom was tense as the jury filed back in. On August 12, 2013, the verdict was read. Bulger was found guilty on 31 of the 32 counts. He was convicted of 11 of the 19 murders, including those of Deborah Davis and 2 other women. The jury found that the government had not proven his involvement in the other 8 killings beyond a reasonable doubt. The conviction on the Davis murder was a significant rejection of his claim that he never killed women. 2 months later, Bulger returned to court for sentencing. Judge Casper sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. She ordered him to pay $19.5 million in restitution to his victims' families. In the courtroom, family members of the victims finally had their chance to speak. They faced Bulger, telling him about the pain and loss he had caused. Bulger showed no emotion, staring straight ahead. He was then led away to begin his sentence at a federal penitentiary. The trial was over, but the story was not. For the families, there was a sense of closure, but the pain remained. For the city of Boston, it was the end of a long, dark chapter. The trial had exposed the deep corruption that had allowed Bulger to thrive. It revealed the tragic consequences when law enforcement makes deals with the devil. The justice system had finally worked, but it had taken too long.
Institutional failure, the prison system, and public accountability. The conviction of James Whitey Bulger represented a significant achievement for the American justice system. However, the subsequent handling of his incarceration revealed serious systemic failures that demand examination. This chapter focuses on the institutional responsibilities surrounding high-profile inmates and the lessons learned from this case. Following his 2013 sentencing, Bulger entered the federal prison system at an advanced age. At 83, he faced significant health challenges requiring medical attention and careful monitoring. The Bureau of Prisons has established protocols for housing elderly inmates with complex medical needs. These protocols are designed to ensure both security and proper care for aging prisoners. Bulger's initial placement at USP Coleman in Florida appeared to follow standard procedures. However, his subsequent transfer to USP Hazleton in West Virginia raised important questions. Hazleton had documented challenges with inmate violence and staffing shortages. The decision to move a vulnerable elderly inmate to such an environment warranted careful consideration. Prison transfers involve multiple layers of review and approval. The process typically considers factors including inmate health, security needs, and institutional resources. In Bulger's case, these standard procedures apparently failed to prevent a tragic outcome. The events of October 29, 2018 highlighted critical vulnerabilities in prison safety protocols. The immediate investigation focused on understanding how such an incident could occur. Official inquiries examined the transfer decision and the reception process at the new facility. The tragedy prompted congressional hearings examining federal prison procedures. Lawmakers from both parties expressed concern about safety standards within the Bureau of Prisons. The investigation revealed several areas requiring reform. Staffing levels at high-security facilities needed reassessment. Protocols for vulnerable inmates required strengthening. Transfer procedures demanded more rigorous review processes. The Department of Justice implemented several reforms in response. Enhanced medical screening before inmate transfers, improved sharing of relevant information between facilities, strengthened protective measures for vulnerable populations. These changes aimed to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The case also sparked important discussions about prison safety generally. Experts emphasized the need for adequate staffing and training. Advocates highlighted the particular vulnerabilities of elderly inmates. Administrators reviewed procedures for identifying and managing high-risk situations. For the legal community, the case reinforced the importance of proper inmate classification. Prison officials must balance security concerns with their duty of care. The correctional system faces complex challenges in housing notorious inmates. Public accountability remains crucial in these situations. Transparent investigations help maintain confidence in our institutions. Thorough reviews ensure that necessary reforms are implemented. Ongoing oversight helps prevent future system failures. The Bulger case ultimately served as a catalyst for positive change. It prompted necessary examinations of prison procedures. It led to meaningful reforms in inmate safety protocols. It reinforced the importance of institutional accountability. While the specific circumstances were unique, the broader lessons apply throughout the correctional system. Every inmate deserves safe and secure confinement. Proper procedures must be followed consistently. Ongoing oversight is essential for maintaining standards. The response to this tragedy demonstrates that our systems can learn and improve. Through careful examination and thoughtful reform, we work toward better outcomes. The pursuit of justice includes ensuring that our correctional systems operate safely and humanely. This commitment to continuous improvement remains essential for maintaining public trust.
The legacy. The Irish mob in the 21st century. The era of iconic Irish mob figures like Whitey Bulger and the Westies has passed. Their violent reigns are now part of American criminal history. But the Irish mob as an entity did not simply vanish. It evolved, adapted, and found new ways to survive in a changing world. The traditional structures of the Irish mob have largely fragmented. The highly centralized gangs of the past have given way to looser, more decentralized networks. These modern groups operate with less visibility, but remain active in specific criminal niches. They have learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. They avoid the media spotlight that ultimately doomed figures like Bulger. They conduct their business with a lower profile, focusing on financial gain rather than notoriety. One of their key strongholds remains the labor unions. The Irish have a long history of influence in organized labor, particularly in cities like New York and Boston. This influence continues to provide opportunities for corruption and racketeering. Modern Irish gangs are involved in infiltrating unions, particularly in the construction industry. They use their positions to embezzle funds, extort businesses, and control hiring practices. This allows them to generate significant revenue with relatively low risk. Another area of continued activity is narcotics. While they no longer dominate the drug trade as they did during the heroin epidemic of the 1970s, Irish gangs remain players. They often act as middlemen, facilitating transactions between larger criminal organizations. Their connections in ports and transportation networks give them a strategic advantage. Money laundering has become more sophisticated. Modern Irish gangs use complex international financial systems to hide their profits. They invest in legitimate businesses, particularly in the hospitality and construction sectors. This allows them to integrate their illicit earnings into the legal economy. The geographic focus has also shifted. While Boston and New York remain important, new hubs have emerged. Cities like Philadelphia and Chicago have active Irish criminal networks. There are also connections to gangs in Ireland itself, particularly in Dublin and Belfast. These transatlantic links facilitate international criminal operations. The nature of the violence has changed as well. The brazen public murders of the past are rare. Modern Irish gangs prefer intimidation and targeted assaults over wholesale slaughter. They use the threat of violence rather than violence itself whenever possible. This makes them harder to prosecute and less likely to attract media attention. Law enforcement has also adapted. The lessons learned from the Bulger case have led to better oversight of informant programs. Task forces now focus on financial crimes and corruption, not just violent acts. International cooperation has improved, making it harder for gangs to operate across borders. The RICO Act remains a powerful tool. Prosecutors use it to target the entire structure of criminal organizations, not just individual members. This has been effective in dismantling some of the remaining Irish gangs. But the fight is ongoing. New generations continue to be drawn into the life. In some neighborhoods, the allure of quick money and local status remains powerful. The economic challenges of the 21st century have created new opportunities for criminal enterprise. The digital age presents both challenges and opportunities for organized crime. Irish gangs have been slower to adapt to cybercrime than some other groups, but there are signs this is changing. Some are involved in online fraud and identity theft. Others use the dark web to facilitate drug sales. The basic principles of organized crime remain the same. It is about providing illicit goods and services. It is about exploiting economic opportunities. It is about power and profit. The Irish mob may no longer produce figures like Bulger, but it has not disappeared. It has simply evolved to survive in a new era. Its legacy is a reminder of the enduring nature of organized crime. It shows that as long as there is demand for illegal activities, there will be groups willing to supply them. The story of the Irish mob is not just a story of the past. It is an ongoing chapter in the history of American crime. Its future, like its past, will be shaped by the same forces: opportunity, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of power.
Conclusion: the enduring myth of the Irish gangster. The story of the Irish mob in America is more than a chronicle of crime. It is a complex narrative woven into the fabric of American immigration and urban history. From the early street gangs of New York to the sophisticated operations of Whitey Bulger, this story reveals much about the American experience. The Irish gangster has become an enduring figure in popular culture. Films like The Departed and The Town romanticize these characters. Television shows and books continue to fascinate audiences with tales of organized crime. But this mythology often obscures the harsh reality. The real story is one of poverty, discrimination, and limited opportunities. It is a story of communities turning to crime when legal paths were blocked. The first Irish gangs emerged from desperate circumstances. The 5 Point slum was a place of unimaginable squalor. Gangs provided protection and a sense of belonging in a hostile world. This pattern would repeat itself for other immigrant groups throughout American history. Prohibition was the great opportunity. It allowed Irish gangs to graduate from street crime to organized rackets. They built sophisticated operations that generated enormous wealth. But this success came at a terrible cost. The violence escalated and the corruption deepened. The alliance between Whitey Bulger and the FBI represents the ultimate corruption of this system. It shows how the line between law enforcement and criminality can become fatally blurred. The consequences of this betrayal are still felt today. Families of victims continue to seek justice and closure. The legal system continues to grapple with the fallout from these cases. For law enforcement, the Bulger case remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of using criminal informants. The evolution of the Irish mob reflects broader changes in American society. As legal opportunities expanded for Irish Americans, the appeal of crime diminished. Each generation found more legitimate paths to success. Today, Irish Americans are fully integrated into the mainstream of American life. They are prominent in politics, business, and every profession. The old stereotypes have largely faded. Yet the criminal element persists, though in diminished form. Modern Irish gangs are shadows of their former selves. They lack the power and influence of previous generations, but they continue to operate in specific niches where they maintain an advantage. The story of the Irish mob offers important lessons about crime and society. It shows that organized crime flourishes where opportunity is scarce. It demonstrates how corruption can undermine even the strongest institutions, and it reveals the human cost of violence and greed. For the communities affected, the legacy is mixed. There is pride in how far Irish Americans have come, but there is also sadness for the lives destroyed along the way. The myth of the gangster continues to exert a powerful pull. It represents rebellion against authority and the pursuit of the American dream through any means necessary. But the reality is far less romantic. It is a story of early graves, broken families, and wasted potential. As we look to the future, the challenge remains. How do we create societies where crime is not an attractive option? How do we ensure that legal opportunities are available to all? How do we break the cycles of violence and corruption? The story of the Irish mob does not provide easy answers to these questions, but it does offer a powerful warning from history. It shows what happens when communities are marginalized and when institutions are corrupted, and it reminds us that the pursuit of justice must be constant and vigilant. The era of the great Irish gangsters may be over, but their story continues to teach us important lessons about power, corruption,
and the enduring search for the American dream.